Chapter 26. Razor Cut. Renoir felt Francois's mouth meet his. He opened his lips again, allowing the rush of air to blow down into his lungs. He let the diluted nitrogen and oxygen play into his bloodstream. Renoir closed his eyes and released it, sending the spent air burbling up to the surface. Against the inside of his eyelids, he saw Leonie's face, but it differed from the one he left behind in Belgium when he went to dump the last of his rifles into the Meuse River. The slapper demon's tale of Leonie's journey continued playing out in Renoir's dying mind. She had aged, certainly, but was still a beauty. That face. A face that could launch 1,000 ships. That face was its own cross to bear. A double-edged sword that cut a path for her in life and cut her to ribbons simultaneously. The shapes and contours of it were a flower that drew all the pollinators in, the hummingbird, the gentle honeybee, the bumble and the carpenter, but also the paper wasp and hornet, the cicada killer and vicious yellow jacket. Before the war, Leonie navigated it all with ease. Her choice to enter the transactional world had been not entirely her own, but given the limited buffet of options before her, she chose this one, and in truth, when she labored under the illusion of safety that Renoir provided, she was reasonably content. That illusion was snatched from above the mantel and smashed to 1,000,000 jagged bits on the floor by the conflict. Good Friday 1917 found her sitting in the master bedroom of a 16th century palace, brushing hair that needed no more brushing to burnish its golden and copper curls, looking into a mirror, but seeing only the past. A knock at the door brought her to the present. The door opened, and Major Hauer was there, in his crisp jodhpurs and polished riding boots, every inch the German knight. Mademoiselle Armitage, the Colonel has requested you for dinner. To devour me, or to dine with him? Major Hauer smiled, shaking his head. To dine with him, of course. Leonie returned to her mirror and ran the brush through her tresses once more. Tell him I shall be content to join him for dinner shortly. Major Hauer paused. Mademoiselle, I know that you are jesting with me. If you please, he has requested that you join him for dinner now. Inside, Leonie seethed. This was the thing that was actually devouring her. In the past, the terms of her life were her own. The men who chose her, she chose as well. And when the transaction was complete, she took the exchange and held her dignity. It was no different to Leonie than selling goods at the Marché de la Ville in the town centre. Over millennia, human beings came to a completely fabricated agreement that pretty gold and silver had some intrinsic value. They did not. Even more worthless paper and metal had been brought in to substitute for the gold and silver, and so one could go to any marketplace and exchange those valueless currencies for food and goods that were, in truth, necessities for life. They absolutely were. It was an odd arrangement, but it was what they had agreed to, and so it became the way of the world. Leonie's marketplace goods of her own volition were her face and her body, the embrace of her arms and legs, her breasts, vulva, and vagina. To the men who sought to purchase rental of those goods from Leonie, the paper and copper could not leave their pockets quickly enough, and she took them as if they were an equitable, valuable exchange. They were absolutely not. Then the war changed everything. She saw three pathways clearly before her after she put Renoir's house to the torch. One pathway was to run. She might have reached France before the Germans erected the Death Road, their 450-kilometre electrified barbed wire fence that caged the Belgians in like chickens and cooked them if they tried to escape. Geneviève, the youngest of Renoir's girls, took that route and succeeded in making it to France. It did not save her life. She ended up a red lamp prostitute to French and British soldiers instead of German ones. It was not a better ending than her other options in the long run. The second pathway, the rest of Leonie's mates took. They sold their wares on the cheap to the German war machine. It gladly dropped its pennies into their laps and gobbled them up. By Good Friday, they were no more. Syphilis got them all. It killed Marie outright. The other pair, Eugénie and Francine, were shot for spreading it amongst the German troops, as if they were typhoid Marys, and not the victims of infected sergeants and corporals who carry the disease with them in their cocks from Berlin and Munich. Another way. Leonie knew that there must be another way. Then Colonel Goethe sat before her on the divan and offered his protection, and Leonie knew there was a price that she would have to pay. But of all the options fate now laid at her feet, this one seemed the only sensible route. She decided that yes was the answer before he finished the sentence. And in that moment, without even realizing it, she sold herself short. The cost was steep. Erich Goethe now owned her and never had to pay a penny for what he desired. Yes had, perhaps, been the wrong answer. Now, instead of bartering for paper, which she could use however she wished or needed, her body bought her only what he was willing to give. Leonie reached the end of the agreement a little over a year prior. On Christmas Eve of 1915, after a huge party with the officer corps, Leonie fucked Goethe with everything that she had. After he was spent, she popped the cork on a fourth bottle of champagne and pretended to drink it with him. He eased into oblivion sleep, and she pried herself away from his stinking, drunk flesh. She dressed in the firelight, took the jewelry she could carry, and closed the door to the master bedroom silently. They caught her before she could enter the woods. They dragged her to the chateau, kicking and screaming. Eric did not beat her, though he wanted to. His rage and shame burned hot, but he did not vent that heat in a rush. He held the flame close and kept it burning. He had fucked her every night since that Christmas Eve, and it had not been for pleasure, or at least not pleasure of a sexual nature. It was a violent assertion of ownership. It told Leonie that no exchange was occurring. In his mind, she was paid for in full. He was not giving her protection in return for her favors. He owned her and would do with her as he pleased. Leonie endured it for a year and a quarter. Good Friday of 1917 was the end of it. She filched Eric's Petrus Sard and Brothers straight razor from his shaving kit. Its black celluloid handle and curved tang were in her purse. She knew there was nowhere to run, but she was filled to the brim with his useless fucks. No more. It ended tonight. In this, she was 100% correct. It would indeed all end that night, but not at all in the way that she imagined. Isaiah pulled the long ash limb through the woods. He found the little pool and dragged it in behind him. Francois ducked into the water and sent another breath into Renoir's mouth. Isaiah felt under the pith of the tree beside Renoir. He grabbed handfuls of cold mud and dug them out. He looked to Caitlin. "Give me one of them stones. Biggest, flattest one you got." Caitlin scoured the pile of rocks she had dug out from beside Renoir. A large, squarish piece of granite caught her eye. Isaiah took it from her and lowered it into the water, a foot from the tree trunk. Francois took another breath of air down to Renoir. Isaiah lifted the ash limb and jammed the end into the hole he had dug out beneath the felled tree. He kicked the stone Caitlin had given him, wedging the lever at a 45-degree angle firmly against the trunk. He splashed to the arm of the ash limb and began pulling down on it, trying to use his weight to lever the tree off of Renoir. It did not move. "Francois, help me here!" Francois nodded. He took one more deep gulp of air and pressed his face into the opaque brown water, finding Renoir's mouth and breathing into it. He was uncertain if Renoir had taken the air or not. The panic of the thought sent him up to the surface. He splashed to Isaiah's side and grabbed hold of the limb with him. Both men pulled down, applying their weight to the lever. The end beneath the tree groaned. Then it snapped off. "Fuck!" hollered Isaiah. He scrambled down and pulled the broken end out. He chucked it aside and shoved the long end into where it had been. "Francois, you pull up on the thing while me and Miss Caitlin lever it." Francois hustled to the tree. Caitlin and Isaiah grabbed the lever. "Put your weight into it, a little bit at a time," he told her. Caitlin nodded. Together they melded to the lever and pulled down. The limb bowed, but it did not snap. Francois bent his thick legs, pressed his chin against the wet bark, and dug his hands and forearms beneath the tree. With all he had, he hugged the tree to his chest and straightened his legs. He let out a roar as the tree budged a quarter inch. He flexed his thighs and pushed, feeling the strain rush blood through his entire body, stretching and pulling tendons, veins filled and near bursting, muscle fiber at the edge of tearing loose. The mastiff started barking, elated. There was a great sucking sound as the fallen tree broke free, levered and hefted out of the mud. Immediately, the pool began to drain through the conduit. Francois stopped at his breaking point and held the tree fast, suspended an inch above Renoir's chest. "Get him!" shouted Francois. Isaiah shoved the ash limb in as far under as he could. He left Caitlin holding it and vaulted the fallen tree. He grabbed Renoir's legs, got his boots up under his arms, then stepped back, dragging Renoir free from the tight canal like some muddy breech baby. As Renoir slid clear, Francois's back gave out and the tree went crashing back to earth. He and Caitlin came over the timber and found Isaiah. He looked up, helpless. Renoir was not breathing. Caitlin slid down beside him in the mud. She tilted Renoir's head and closed his nose with her thumb and forefinger. She took a breath in, and just as Francois had done, she brought her lips to his and exhaled life into him. The air filled his lungs, joining the water inside them. They ballooned up, then the air and water exploded out of him. Caitlin rolled him onto his side and hit his back firmly with the palm of her hand. Renoir's body shook as he coughed and choked the muddy water out onto the ground. He got in one ragged breath, then another fit of coughing shook him. The second breath was measured. By the third, the coughing ceased. Isaiah leaned in and looked him in the eyes. He patted his shoulder and smiled at him. "You have a pleasant soak in the bath, son Renoir." Renoir would have liked to smile, but was not prepared to do so just yet. He nodded. A shiver of cold vibrated through him. They all helped him up to sitting. As they sat back on his haunches, "You still son Renoir, right?" Ain't nobody take your place while you was out of there, right? He said, almost entirely in jest. That got a half smile through chattering teeth. I'm still here, said Renoir. We need a fire, said Caitlin. Isaiah looked around at the soaking woods. Shit, even if we had a mess of gasoline, nothing around here gonna burn for days. Best thing we can do till that sun starts giving some heat is get him up and get to walking. It was not the answer that any of them wanted, but it was the truth. Francois and Isaiah helped Renoir to standing. Then they half carried him up the stream and back toward the road, with the Mastiff leading the way. From among the scattered dead, Francois had dragged out of Renoir's pool. Caitlin collected the shotgun and slung it. She glanced at the dead men's faces and the remnants of their novel death trap. The depth of the cruelty and sadism behind Renoir's torture were beyond her. The obvious pleasure they took in asserting their physical power over him shook her to the core. Which was not to say she was above violence. She knew for certain that she was not. All she had to do was close her eyes and she could see the face of the man she shot in the name of the Fenians, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and the Clan na Gael on Easter of 1916. But the act, and certainly the memory of it, brought her no joy. His face had worn away at her daily for the past year until she renounced the cause to Finbar on Good Friday. She felt certain that his face would continue to wear away at her until the day she died, which might honestly come at any time now. Miss Caitlin, Isaiah called from the bend in the stream. Come on along now. You let them dead bury the dead. Caitlin slung the shotgun in its shell pouch. She picked up Francois's cutlass along with Isaiah's bayonet and followed after them.